Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Marc, still in chapter 1. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. Here ends this morning's reading.
Good morning. On this Sabbath morning in Capernaum, Jesus clearly made a good impression on his listeners. Astounded at his teaching, they declare that he speaks as one having authority, not as the scribes. Their comparison between Jesus's way of teaching and that of the scribes is significant. The scribes were religious teachers respected for their knowledge and were certainly not lacking in authority in the Hebrew culture. Yet people were struck that day by the dynamic difference between the teaching of the scribes and that of Jesus. The scribes always referred to ancient texts of great rabbis, teachers of the law. Their authority came from navigating these great ones' messages. But now Jesus speaks and acts with power and influence in the present moment, alive to the Spirit at work right now in front of them. Well, then suddenly a dramatic scene develops. A man in a rage interrupts him, asking why he is there. With the paranoia we see all too often in our time, he asks Jesus if he is out to destroy them. Then almost in the same breath, he declares that he knows that Jesus is the Holy One of God. In response, Jesus commands the unclean spirit to come out of the man, and it obeys. With loud cries and convulsion, the spirit leaves the man's body. This event in Capernaum is the first of Jesus's many acts of exorcism in Mark's gospel. You find most of those exorcisms in Mark's version. What does this story mean for our understanding today in the scientific and postmodern age, a time skeptical of the notion of exorcism? Now, I have to admit, many times in the past year of vitriol and contempt, I would have been happy to see a little exorcism practiced as a healing technique on a few folks with seemingly unleashed venom. For that matter, we live in a time with little reverence for true authority either. First, let's consider authority. It seems that real authority demands real listening, and that a capacity to really listen takes time. Years of listening, years of being present to life around you, people, events, ideas, culture, history, the natural world, scripture, and one's internal imagination and landscape. This presence is a presence of mind, heart, and body, bringing the whole self, and more than the self, forward in one's listening. Real authority is grounded here in deep humility. The seat of our authority is not simply in the sophistication of our thought or the amount of knowledge over which we have command. This speech and the courage to speak it comes from deep trust in the knowledge of the heart, itself a profoundly receptive organ. The word courageous, poor things, you have to listen to me repeat things over and over, but sometimes I forget, and I'm the one that wrote it. The word courageous comes from the French root coeur, C-O-E-R, which means heart. When we are awake and receptive in the presence of this kind of authority like that of which Jesus possessed, we sense this presence of the heart, this coeur, this courageous heart. We're struck by an awareness that in the words and actions we hear the wisdom of an invisible world being revealed. At times, we feel the presence of this almost otherworldly wisdom in people we meet personally or in their writings. The civil rights leader, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., had a profound impact on his time and on the half a century which has followed his death. He spoke with a presence that clearly, courageously, and eloquently engaged the current moment, but was also preparation for a future reality. Another civil rights leader who walked with King and then lived another 50 years into our own time was the late John Lewis. John Lewis, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives for, catch this, 17 terms. And those terms are a couple years apiece. 17 terms. He was also a civil rights activist and an authoritative voice for the civil rights movement his whole life. He was one of the big six leaders who organized the March on Washington in 1963, the 1965 March from Montgomery to Selma, Alabama, as well as many other marches for freedom and justice. He's one of the first of the 13 Freedom Riders. He was beaten and jailed, I think 28 times for his activism. Reverend Lewis was also a Baptist preacher committed to nonviolence and reconciliation. He'll be remembered for many things, not least, as Marc alluded to, his counsel to engage in good trouble, necessary trouble, to bring about important change. The story of his life tells more than just the events of one life, but tells the broader story of a critical time in our shared history. A prophetically authoritative voice doesn't view the future as a distant unknown. King didn't. John Lewis didn't. The future for these prophetic voices is a reality already in the process of becoming. The future for great souls like these both is, but also is not yet. Lewis spoke to this nation of a dream that could be opened up within us and around us. Even in the dourest present moment, Black and brown people began to feel hope for their future. They felt a return of their dignity and their worth. As John Lewis spoke commandingly, but also compassionately about what could be, people knew that this seed of what could be already existed within them. It was a light they already carried. Those who felt Reverend Lewis's deep commitment to live with astounding courage in the present moment, well, they began to trust, even when there was a knee to the neck, that a liberating spirit was already stirring, that the future was coming toward them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor and inspiring theologian, courageously followed the call of the Spirit to become part of the German resistance to the Nazis in another troubled time, World War II. And he was imprisoned in a concentration camp and he died a martyr. Brilliant man. In his writings from prison, he describes what it means to speak with authority. Someone can only speak to me with authority if a word from the deepest knowledge of my humanity encounters me here and now in all my reality. Any other word is impotent, just a bunch of words. The word of the church is the word of the church to the world must therefore encounter the world in all its present reality from the deepest knowledge of the world, if it is to be authoritative. So we are called at important times in life to speak with authority, not like the scribes, carefully describing what we already know, but closed off a bit to new truth. The voices of Bonhoeffer, King, and John Lewis were prophetic voices, and as such, they became voices of authority. They were so courageously present to the moments in which they lived that they would continue to speak with authority even after their deaths. Well, now let's look a little closer at this notion of exorcism, this casting out of an unclean spirit. We might be tempted to say that this man was crazy, meaning he had some physiological abnormality of the brain, perhaps. Or he was having a seizure, an epilepsy of sorts, all the convulsing and all that's described. But let's hold back at least for a moment and resist easing our own confusion about what happened by forming a seal-tight conclusion out of our cultural preconception that madness has a physiological explanation. Let's consider for a moment that an unclean spirit is indeed a spirit. The unclean spirit is a spirit which seduces us into its lie. It leads us down a path into things that are falsely important. Egotism, profound egotism, fear, paranoia, blind competition, racial distrust. These lies, parading as truth, distance you further and further from the truth that gives life. The seductiveness of an unclean spirit keeps us from feeling the subtlety of the divine spirit moving through us. By appealing to our most base instincts and forming generalizations and fixed opinions around these very base instincts, it prohibits us from hearing nuanced particulars of our experiences as they speak their humble truth in the present moment. Let me say that again. That is one complicated sentence. By appealing to our most base instincts and forming generalizations and fixed opinions about these, it gets in the way of our hearing the more nuanced particulars of truth as it comes out in the present moment. Stagnant ideas, once formed, well, in a way, they're already dead. They're closed off to the present moment, facing right in front of your face, a moment which can teach and inspire each of us to fresh ways of living and knowing. If we focus exclusively on the evil, only on the evil of what is being cast out, we can miss what as a result is being let in, being allowed in. We get in our own way when we let the unclean spirit of stagnancy block our path. We do not allow then the future to become what it is seeking to become. In his book, Writing in the Sand, Jesus and the Soul of the Gospels, author Thomas More attempts to help us understand these biblical exorcisms performed by Jesus. He accepts that there is a demonic streak found in human beings that can lead to rage and violence. He writes, in many ways, possession is like obsession. Something gets hold of you. Has anybody ever been obsessed with anything? I do believe you would be lying if you didn't say so. But in possession, something gets hold of you and you lose your free will. In spite of all your efforts to the contrary, you focus on one thing and you can't be released from it. Sometimes the object of your fascination would horrify you if you were in your right state of mind. But possession is a step beyond obsession. You feel taken over by a presence so strong that your usual self seems to disappear. Well, you probably get the idea that some of my interest in this today comes out of the events in the recent days of our nation, the violent messages and actions committed by people on the internet, spewing hatred, planning carefully, coming together as a mob, bearing weapons and messages of hate, and unleashing them upon leaders in government and law enforcement, killing and wounding many. Marc continues, possession is not just a state of anxiety, and Jesus was not just a master therapist. He wasn't curing mental illness with exorcisms, but expurgating the demonic. Oh, excuse me. That's a tough one. Expurgating the demonic. Jesus faced the demonic head on and was able to heal a person by ridding him of the demonic influence that controlled him. As people of faith, we cannot allow the intolerant and reactionary, yes, demonic voices around us to overpower the Spirit's call to community, to inclusiveness, to cooperation, to compassion. We must face the demonic head on as we seek life-giving spirit, even in the hateful chaos of our world. Can we access the necessary humility, the stopping and listening, and really listening with the courage of our heart to connect us both to the invisible world of the Spirit and the material, everyday events of life around us? In order to speak with a lasting and real authority, we must bring mind and body and spirit to embrace the newness of each moment as we listen for its truth. To speak with authority, we must be awake and ready to receive new and fertile ideas. These fertile and living ideas are paradoxically often mirrored in ancient sacred stories, like the Gospels. The images, the events, the characters, the poetry of Scripture can inspire an unmoored world, and each of us personally to hear the call of the future. That is what the United Church of Christ means when they declare, God is still speaking. God is still speaking, not just to us, but through us, through a variety of peoples and places and generations and even religions. God speaks God's living and earthly truth into time. God speaks God's living and earthly truth into time. And when this happens, a voice of authority is born. Amen.